Here we go. Welcome to another episode of Inside the Business with Nancy Kay Coy. And this is where we slow conversations down and we talk honestly about business leadership and the decisions that really shape how we live and how we lead. And because the conversations that matter most are often, they're not the loudest. And so the ones that really create the clarity, the ones that challenge the way we think, and the ones that move us forward are what we try to talk about in these conversations. So today we're going to talk about something I think every single business owner or executive leader should care about. And this is where the money in business is often lost, but it's often not seen. And it's not the obvious losses. It's not the big mistakes that show up the right way, but the small leaks, that the repeated misses, the blind spots inside operations and in procurement, maintenance, capital projects, construction, and really process, the kind of issues that can quietly become death by 1,000 cuts. And joining me today is Michael Grabianowski, founder and president of Grabianowski and Associates LLC. And Michael brings really a unique background in engineering, accounting, operations, really internal audits, financial controls, and process improvement. His firm really helps businesses reduce cash flow, cash outflow, and by detecting and preventing unnecessary cost and waste before it becomes a much bigger problem. And we actually, Michael and I had a conversation, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and just a great conversation. And I was like, wait a minute, hold on. As we were talking, I said, I really would love to have you on Inside the Business, because this is such a big issue that I think most businesses just don't pay much attention to, and they really should. So Michael, welcome to Inside the Business. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm real excited about doing this with you.
Well, we are going to, I think, really help some people understand what's really going on out there, and how you can really save them some money. So for people who hear the word cost control or process improvement and immediately think of audits or spreadsheets, how do you explain what you actually do really in plain language?
So what I try to do, I try to help folks understand where they have opportunities within the life cycle of either a project, an operations event, or, in many cases, just the old procure to pay process. I help to look for where you have opportunities where you may be slowly bleeding, as you referenced. So real quick as to why I kind of did this and got into this. I had an opportunity in my career, the last time I worked in private industry, to develop a capability when I was working for Georgia Pacific called commercial controls. And the idea of it was, we did some recovery audits. They're known as AP recovery audits. Some of you out there in the audience may have heard of these before. You've had firms approach you. They say, hey, we'll audit your accounts payable, and we'll find opportunities where you potentially could have overpaid. So when you try to get that money back, it sometimes can be a disjointed process. It's very difficult to get folks to say, yes, I'll give you that money back. Yeah. And sometimes it can actually disrupt your relationship with some of your vendors and your contractors. So what I was charged with doing is creating a capability that helps prevent that outflow from happening in the first place, so you don't have to chase after it goes out the door. The way that you do that is you need to figure out why that money's going out first and foremost, and then make sure that you improve the process, and then close gaps, check to make sure that they remain closed. And then you have a follow-up, and sometimes you actually have some add-ons. Like, for instance, what we would do is we would also do for a select number of projects, we would do what's called a concurrent or parallel invoice review. So if you do an audit, you're looking at that invoice after you've made the payment to determine whether or not you've overpaid. What I would do, and this is what I do in my own business now, I help clients by, when necessary, doing that parallel review and stopping the payment from going out the door. And this can be done through technology. So when I worked in private industry, we leveraged AI for some of that. And I leveraged some technologies as well within my own business. Some of it you can't. It depends on the quality of what you get from your vendor or your contractor. So when, in a real quick and dirty, that's kind of what I do is, rather than chasing after the dollars and doing that audit, I do the audit before you need the audit, more or less.
Which I thought was always when we talked before, I thought was really astounding, because basically what you're saying is you're helping them. It's almost like stopping fraud before it happens,
Yes.
right? To a large degree. So the other thing I thought was really interesting is your background. Not only do you have this engineering background, but you also have a financial background. So maybe talk about that a little bit.
So, I had somebody ask me, I was on a discovery call with a potential client this week, and somebody asked me, hey, did you plan to be what you are, or did you just happen to end up doing what you do? And I said, well, early on, life takes you down a path. So I kind of ended up on this path. And then after a while, it sort of made sense. And a lot of times in your career, you kind of end up where you need to be. You kind of flow to where you need to be and where you can create the most value for someone. And then that's what happened with me. It was originally driven by mine and my wife's desire to live at the beach. So when I started my career, I grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in South Jersey along the coast. I went to Ocean City High School, and I'd always been that beach bum, and I always lived near the coast. My wife met me, and she was from Pittsburgh. She wanted to live at the beach. And, when I studied materials engineering, so I worked in manufacturing in Southern New Jersey. I worked in a number of different industries there prior to moving down south to Georgia. But, I was lucky. I had a supervisor that kind of kicked me in the butt, said, hey, you're very specialized as a materials engineer, and it's always going to put you at a disadvantage, and you're going to be at a mercy wherever those jobs are. He always knew that I liked being at the beach. So I ended up going back for my MBA, and I didn't know what to concentrate in. And I had a few different things happen to me at the time, one of which I was trying to save that company. So that's one of the reasons I've also started my business as well, is I want to help people that are struggling to control costs. First plant I worked at, I watched it go from 1,200 employees down to about 175. And I happened to be one of those 175. So I went through about a series of 6 layoffs. That was my first job.
Wow.
And, I saw a lot of what takes a company down. And, I was a process engineer trying to help save the facility. And I actually I had this capital project that I was trying to get approved at the time. And it was going to reduce carpal tunnel, which was a problem that we had. We had a lot of work-related injuries.
Absolutely.
And it was going to be a major improvement to the process, health and safety. And it would have put us in a really good position. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but long and short, it had a very quick ROI, less than a year. It paid back very quickly. And because of the dire straits that the facility was in, and ultimately they were going to shut it down, the project got rejected and it didn't go forward. And that disappointed me. And it was actually there's a controller or CFO at the time that pretty much put the kibosh on it. And I was very frustrated by that. And I said, here's an opportunity for someone that really understands the boots on the ground approach, what happens out in the field, and someone in the front office also having that respect and understanding the needs for the business in order for it to thrive. So that kind of got me thinking about that. And my wife is an accountant. So she, was on the path to becoming a CPA at the time. She said, if you concentrate your MBA in accounting, you could always sit for the CPA exam if you wanted to. So I thought that was a good idea. So I did that. Long and short, the path that ultimately got me to where I'm at, many other steps in between. But I worked for a number of companies, several of which were very much struggling or shut down in Southern New Jersey. And eventually we ended up moving to Georgia. And I went back into manufacturing for a few years, being an engineering manager for a company south of Atlanta. And then I had the opportunity to go over to Georgia Pacific. And I work in their internal audit group. And they brought me in. They said, we were hiring you because we think you know where all the skeletons are buried. And in many regards, that was true. When you work in the field, you see a lot of stuff, especially in manufacturing. Anybody that's worked in manufacturing will tell you always come home with a story to tell. And so I had seen quite a bit. So I ended up working on whistleblower investigations, bid rigging, collusion investigations. I saw quite a bit over my tenure there. And when I had the opportunity to create that unique capability the company never had before, it became very apparent to me that there's a lot of opportunity there. And when you look at enough spend across thousands of vendors, tens of thousands of vendors, to be honest, it's a very large company, you see that it is a habitual problem across the United States. It isn't necessarily, alone or alienated to a specific region or type of spend. It's all across the board. Anybody that does this for a living or does anything peripheral to what I do will tell you there's tremendous opportunity here. Some nefarious, some just sloppy record keeping. There's a number of reasons why you overpay, and understanding the root cause of that is what allows you to prevent it.
So that was going to be one of my first questions: is where do these costs usually hide?
So, I remember having this conversation when I worked in private industry. It's like, well, eventually we're going to be really good. We don't need to do the work that your team does. And the challenge that I always had back was we don't control the processes of our vendors and contractors. Now, when you have a lot of buying power, for like a Walmart or something like that, they dictate and say, hey, your bar program better scan or we're going to kick you out. You can do things like that. So if you have a lot of buying power, you can negotiate, for instance, the structure of your invoice. You can negotiate contracts better. When you don't have that kind of leverage, you're more or less at the mercy. And understanding when you have the leverage and when you don't have leverage is also a gift that I try to give to folks, and understanding where you can challenge and when you can't challenge. But when you don't control those processes, I've seen handwritten invoices. Everyone talks about AI now, and we leveraged it in private industry, and I'll advocate for that with clients when necessary. But you're also limited by the processes of those vendors. So if they're not using 400 DPI perfect resolution oriented properly, so OCR tools can scan that in and reconcile it virtually, you're at the mercy of what's in that paper. And there's a lot of times where I've seen misscans and things like that. So you can just naturally overpay just by your process alone, not ingesting invoices properly. You can overpay by people having poor record keeping on their ends. Like, for instance, a lot of companies, their accounts receivable departments don't always have access to the commercial terms and conditions. They just bill what they see. They'll talk to somebody. For instance, if you're building something or constructing something, they may say to the foreman or the project manager or the construction manager that's running that for them, hey, can we invoice for this month? And they'll say, yeah, go ahead, invoice. But what does that mean? Do you invoice for the full?
What does that really mean? Yeah.
Yeah. So, you have.
So go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Nancy. Ask a question.
So what is really the difference between recovering money after the fact and preventing the loss really before it happens? Because when we were talking, you were talking a lot about, we talked about almost preventing fraud before it happens, and getting in and figuring this out before we start losing money.
Yeah, it's most advantageous to do it, obviously, before the money goes out. There's a lot of reasons why you want to do that. The conversation that you have, and a lot of people, this is the other thing, most of the time, you need to have what's known as an audit clause within your contract that enables you to do that in the first place. Most people know to put it there, but it's not always the case, especially for smaller entities. They may not know to put that there. With my process, you don't necessarily have to have it. It's always advantageous to have it. And I would always advocate for having it in the contract if that's part of the scope of what I'm engaged with the client with. But if you don't have that there and then you try to get it, you may not be able to. They may put their foot down. They may be savvy and say, you don't have the right to do this. And then you're then you can negotiate and say, hey, well, I'm not going to do business with you in the future. It's not a good way to do business always. So that's why I think it's not as always advantageous. But my process, it's much different when you have somebody that's on your team that you're working for a client and you see an error in the billing. And then you call up, for instance, a project manager or someone that has oversight of that and say, hey, I'm going through this 400 pages of invoicing that I've got for your project, and I'm seeing an anomaly. I'm seeing where they've charged us a markup for materials above and beyond what's in our contract. Yeah. Are you aware of anything that may have changed that? Or talk to someone in their procurement team and ask that question. Or, hey, you know what? I remember very early on, something I noticed was that there was duplication of materials within an invoice. And I asked that question to a project manager. Hey, did we do this twice? And the answer is no. Then you say, well, we've got a problem. Then you engage with the contractor and you can do it very nicely and say, hey, we think we have an error within your invoice, your payment application. We think that you've overcharged us. Could you please take a look at this before we pay this? We want to make sure that it's correct. So when you take that approach, you get a much better outcome. Because if you catch them with their hand in the cookie jar, you didn't necessarily tell them, hey, go collect all the bonuses you just paid out to all your executives and get it back and give it to me. You're now saying, hey, we think we found something here. We're looking. We're not accusing you of anything, but please clear this up for us. Much better approach.
Oh, absolutely. Because you're not going to have people automatically on the defense, because that was going to be one of my questions too. So, and thank you for answering that. So you spent obviously part of your career in operations and engineering, and then moved into the doing the internal audits and the financial controls. And what did you really start to notice that others were missing?
A lot of people, they assume. So, and it's not because, and this kind of goes back to, when I was charged with kind of developing a AI tool when I worked in private industry, one of the things that I was very adamant about was looking at behaviors. Mm-hmm. So for instance, let's say you have a project manager that goes into your ERP on a Friday afternoon at like 4:55, and they rapid fire approve $1 million. Mm-hmm. Now, if they log off at 5 o'clock right after doing that, you may say, maybe there may not be something nefarious there. However, you can pretty much assume that due diligence may not have happened. So what you want to do is look to see, what are your folks doing? Are they really complacently agreeing invoicing? Most people have this assumption, especially in large companies where an invoice comes to them. They assume that it was vetted and it wouldn't come to their desk unless it was warranted for payment. They assume that there's controls that happen behind the scenes that would prevent it from coming to their desk. It's just a mental model. People have that assumption that if it's coming to me, it must be right. And they don't really understand that as an invoice approver, you are, as part of most companies' internal financial control framework, are a responsible steward of the company's money to make sure that you're only paying what you should. So if you have somebody, like a lot of people, they don't value invoice approval. Most people just don't. They view it as just an unnecessary, rubber stamp operation. I hate to say it, but many people just do. And it's not necessarily because they don't want to. It's a lot of times because they have very busy jobs. Many people have very busy jobs. And approving invoices, they don't necessarily always earmark time for doing it properly. So a lot of people just kind of do it as something that's just make work that they need to do. And they'll put it off at the end of the week usually. They'll do it on a Friday afternoon, like I said. So what we would do is we would look at that and say, hey, there's a potential here for something that happened that we may want to take a look at. So that's a lot of what, my team when I worked in private industry would do. And that's what I do in my business now, is that I help people try to identify where you have maybe some complacency, or maybe you have a process gap where somebody isn't really doing that due diligence. That's a very important piece to look at.
So when you started your company, so for our audience, and many of which are entrepreneurs and startup founders similar to you, as you started your firm, what was harder, Michael, than you really expected?
The marketing piece. So, the nice thing, and I think anybody can relate to this that starts up their own business, the value of doing it is you do a lot of things that you do not have a comparative advantage, that it is something outside your wheelhouse, doing the marketing, doing the IT, doing maybe accounting, which is probably not always recommended when you can hire that out easier. But there are a lot of hats that you wear. I've worn all the hats, continue to wear most of the hats. And, the one that I probably took for granted the most is the amount of effort it takes to get a really good message out there, to identify your marketplace, and to have a clear and concise message that people can readily understand what you do. That was I've had a lot of people that just don't understand what I do to this day. And it's very difficult getting out that clear and concise message that's short enough, digestible enough that gets the message across. And that took me a lot of time to figure out. And then when you do get people, figuring out, what are their needs and what are their challenges in their business.
It's really funny because running a business is not easy. And a lot of people I think you're not alone in that. When you start a company, it's all about revenue. Mm-hmm. And that you have a different perspective almost for the value of sales and marketing. Do you, the people that you worked with in those organizations, I think when we talked a couple of weeks ago, we talked about that a little bit, that you have now you know why they make the money they make.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times throughout my career, I pull up to a facility or something like that. And, when I worked in internal audit or you're the controllers group or whatnot, you pull up in a little a mid-size or Econo box car. And then you see somebody in like sales and procurement roll up at the M5 BMW. You're like, what gives?
Yeah.
But you see, yeah. So I took for granted a lot of their efforts probably over the years, and I'm probably in purgatory for that right now.
Well, and it's an interesting lesson because people will say a lot of times, how come these salespeople make so much money? And it's like, well, because being the face of the company and getting those meetings, and not only getting the meeting, but getting the implementation and carrying it all the way through, it really is one of the hardest jobs. It really is.
It is. So, I have a total different perspective. I think it's great, just to wear the hat. Long term, it's not my plan to wear the hat. But the fact that I've done it, it offers I think there's a tremendous amount of value that goes into doing, especially, and I'm a big fan of this. I learned this at a Japanese company. I became engineering manager. Before I became engineering manager, I had to do all the jobs on the floor. You walk through and you do the different jobs. And, it was one of those things where, they wanted you to understand how everyone does their job. And I think there's a deep respect that comes from that. So I think it's a really good exercise, for those that, that can't afford to have all of the services outsourced immediately right off the bat. It's a good learning curve to really understand your whole business from end to end.
It's funny because I've actually done that same thing myself where some of my teams, I've said, you need to spend a couple of days with the frontline teams, because they're architects too, even though they have sometimes the title of sales, which, you know that I'm not a big fan of that word, but, but I see the people that are on the front lines, they are architecting those relationships, because it is a craft. So kind of circling back again to your business. So where do you typically see, I guess, the biggest areas of leakage? Is it in the procurement? Is it in the contracts? Because you've done a lot in construction. And when we talked, your business, in my mind, filters onto almost any organization. And I shared with you healthcare and dentistry, I think, could benefit greatly from your expertise. But so kind of, again, maintenance, operation, communication, or is it something else?
It happens, it's not it would be so easy if it was just in one spot. It can happen in a myriad of places. A lot of times, like large construction projects, a lot of times people, much like I explained the invoicing, there's a lot of front-end loading that gets done on a construction project that unfortunately a lot of project teams don't always give it the credit that it's due, those steps that they need to take in making sure that you've done all that work on the front end to mitigate the risk and have a successful project. A lot of people, and this happens, especially when you get really experienced in your career. And I'm at fault for this too. Many times throughout my career, where you become very experienced in a specific process or area and you do a new project there, you're like, I don't need to go through all those steps. I know what I'm doing. I can skip ahead, hit the fast forward button, and I don't need to do that. And that's usually where you get bit. So I kind of focus from the beginning, and that's where I like to really get engaged with clients, is on the front end, very early in a project, and making sure that they're mitigating that risk and they're taking the time to do all the due diligence to set the project up for success. There's a reason why you have those different phase gates as you move through a project, and that's to make sure that you're ready to go to the next phase, So when you start out and you have the origination of the project all the way up through to your procurement phase, and then your construction phase, and then you have, eventually your closeout and your post-completion, is making sure that each of those phases have been giving the proper due diligence for success. So, and if you don't do it right on the front end, the very, 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 very early front end, if you don't set up yourself up for success, it's like building a house. If the foundation isn't built properly, the rest of the house, it's a moot point. It's just going to be, it's going to be leaning tower Pisa.
You're going to have issues.
You're going to have issues. So that's it starts always at the beginning, early phases. And many projects that I've seen, especially ones that go very far over budget, they usually had a very poor planning and execution phase early in the project, and that kind of led them down the path of failure. And sometimes it's the default of the project team, maybe not so much. A lot of times, if you have a project that's, for instance, EH&S related, you have an environmental impact project, maybe there's some government regulations that have been passed and you need to react quickly, maybe more quickly than you feel comfortable doing. Those can also be projects that can lead you to failure and ruin. I've seen that where people have really not done a good job in really doing the venture summary on the front end to determining whether or not that project is even worth doing. So if you're required, maybe it's an old facility that it's always on the edge. Do we shut it down or yes or no?
Or do you,
The go, no go, and you're trying to figure out whether or not you invest that capital into that business, you can make the wrong decision if you go too quick. And I've seen that where people have said, you know what, we probably would have shuttered that facility and invested in one of our other facilities. That happens. So very early on is when you really, the cracks start to make themselves known. And if you don't plan right there, eventually you get to the phase where you're like Jack Nicholson at the end of The Shining, where you don't know where you are if you haven't planned right. So you get to the point where you're starting to do the project and then things start falling apart. And what happens? You have what's called contingency drawdown. So you have this 10% contingency that most people put into their projects. Well, the drawdown rate pretty much tells you how well you planned for it. Because if you're drawing down that contingency really fast, that means you didn't do a lot of due diligence on the front end. And if you start to have lots of change orders and the budget starts creeping, and that means that you didn't do a good job. And unfortunately, you see this a lot in industry. And this is one of my challenges. Most of the work that I do is on cost reimbursable or time material type work. But fixed price is also an area I can help people. But a lot of people, especially in public right now, are pushing towards fixed price contracts. They think that they're shifting the risk burden to the contractors. Not always the case. Especially a lot of people, and I think this is something for any of you listening out there that do projects. I hear this all the time. People are like, well, we only do lump sum. We only do fixed price. Wrong answer. If that's what you get from your project team, or your procurement team, wrong answer. I can't think of one business that you should always do fixed price or lump sum contracts.
I would think because isn't that really highly likely or highly probable that, especially when you're dealing with tech, right?
Yeah. Well, if you've got wherever, the most important thing with fixed price, lump sum, or knowns and unknowns. So when you have a high potential for unknowns, things that you're going to hit your project that you're going to have to course correct for, you do not want to do a fixed price contract. Contractors know this. And if they accept a fixed price contract, they've either done one of two things. They feel confident that they can change order you to death and you're going to accept it. Or they don't think you're going to challenge. Or they've built so much profit into that contract, they don't care.
They have flexibility.
Yeah. I mean, if you do a really good lump sum fixed price contract and you negotiate it well, all things being equal, if you have a very strong scope of work and you stick to it, then you have a very good likelihood of success there. However, that's not always reality. And people try to force fit projects that should not be fixed price or lump sum to that model that probably should be time and material, maybe time and material not to exceed, cost plus guaranteed maximum price. There's understanding what is the best fit contract is another place where people lose money. They think that based on, they may have had an experience with a certain pricing model on a project and just say, well, it was that pricing model that screwed us over. Well, maybe not. Maybe you just put the wrong contracting strategy to the wrong project. You need to understand when it's the best fit. So that's another thing that I try to help people understand is you need to have a healthy mix. If you're a large enough company and you do a number of different things, like you do manufacturing, so you're doing construction and capital, you're doing maintenance events, large maintenance events, you're going to have a healthy mix of different pricing models. And that's what you should say. If you don't have a mix, that means you're leaving opportunity, and you've got an opportunity to course correct and save money. I guarantee you're losing money somewhere. So it's very important that you're doing that decision-making process, that DMF, that decision-making framework of understanding which is the best contracting strategy for what I'm doing at the moment. How much do I know about this project? Have I done this type of project before? Do I have experienced people that I trust to oversee the project? When you do a time and material project, the risk really falls more onto the owner. So the owner of the contract or the project's getting done, that's commissioning that prime contractor to build something for them, they are at risk when they do T&M. Why? Because you're at the mercy of the efficiency of the team. So when you do a lump sum or fixed price, you're shifting that risk to them. So they want to get it done quickly. So you're incentivizing them to get it done quickly.
Get it done faster. Yeah.
Yeah. And what that infers is what most people that are experienced in construction and project management will tell you that your advantage there because you're getting them to put their best people on the project. I can tell you, I've seen many circumstances over the years where that's just not always the case. Especially if you've set the notion that they can change order you and you'll accept it. You're not going to challenge. And I see this a lot too, especially very large companies. If you've got a contractor that's doing multiple different pricing models, very bad practice. That's where you're going to overpay. If, for instance, if you hire somebody to do a capital project and you've got a lump sum, and let's say they've underbid that project, and then you happen to use them also to do a maintenance event during, let's say you shut down your facility for a time and you're having them do a double duty because they've got the manpower to do it. They've got the bandwidth to do it. You feel comfortable with that. If they have set themselves up for failure on the lump sum, they may try to shift some of the costs on the cost reimbursement contract.
Yeah.
So that is another place where you can lose. There's a lot of areas where people bleed. And this is another one that I always hearken to, and I've seen this many times over, are your scrap materials. So when you do a renovation project, let's say you're renovating a building and you are you're putting in a new electrical service. Well, all that copper wire is getting pulled out. Where is that going? Who's managing that? How do you put security around that to make sure that it's going to the landfill, it's getting weighed properly, and that you're getting a credit for it? I've seen circumstances where contractors will take advantage of that. Well, they'll say, hey, we'll take this on. We'll take it for you. We'll give you a credit for it. I've seen that, and I found it where they've given us, half the metals market index for the money, for the material. So, you have to be cognizant that bleed can occur in many places.
Well, it's funny. It was funny because my next question was going to be, what are some of the warning signs that a business may be bleeding money and doesn't know exactly where? And it's like just what you said there, because like you said, like copper or these different areas, they could be, that's revenue. Yep. That they could, and wow.
Well, if you don't have a process, first and foremost, if you do not have company guidelines for how title transfers on scrap materials and things like that, guarantee you probably already lost out there. If you're large enough and you deal enough with that, and part of your business model is renovation, you've most likely lost out on that if you don't have a process in place for that. So you're going to know based on how well structured your internal financial control framework is. So, typically on average, I say I can save clients about 2 to 4% in that range, right, of their budget.
And when you're dealing in these numbers, those are big numbers. Those are big numbers. And
on a $100 million project, $2 to $4 million. So that's a beach house. So it's
on the beach, right?
Yeah.
So how does poor communication between the departments create really unnecessary costs?
So if you don't have really good communications, and I've seen this play out many, many times. So I can remember one time in my career where I saw a maintenance shutdown event occur, and then someone on the procurement team didn't notify all the contractors that the event had been moved 2 weeks out. So guess what? You have 1,000 people come on site and they want to be paid for that. So yes, communication is key. And that's why I say making sure that you have a really, really good, well-defined roles, responsibilities, expectations. The RRDs, those are all well-defined. And you have a RACI matrix, something that gets done very early on projects. One thing that I try to help people and I push for, especially when you're talking about reliability and maintenance events, this is something that I've noticed and have always known. When you do them, most people don't treat them like a capital project. When you do a capital project or a construction project, you put a lot of due diligence usually in these. You put your best people on it. It's an important event for the company to have a successful project because everyone's going to be looking at it. investors, however you're structured,
Yeah.
you're going to have a lot of eyes on it. However, maintenance events are kind of like that redhead stepchild. Nobody cares about them. I hate to say it, but they don't get the love that they deserve. And they're a very important part of your business. And I've seen many times when you do these, they're usually, I don't care if you're a continuous operation or if you're a discrete operation, whatever, whatever business you're in, you have to go through some type of maintenance cycle at some point. Some are longer, some are, more aggressive. It depends on your business. However, when you don't put the right resourcing talents and you don't put that structure around it like a capital project, you have failures there often. And what I lobby for, I try to help teams implement strong controls like you would on a capital project on a maintenance event, with a focus on controlling costs. That's kind of what the differentiation with me is. There are a lot of people that do work similar to mine, right? So we talked about the recovery audits. We talked about, another different areas. But one of the other things people sell is like process improvement, which is one of the things that I do. A lot of people will focus on productivity, quality, stuff like that. And a lot of those things do occur and are a byproduct of my processes. You'll have a better quality, you'll have a better OEE and productivity and whatnot. But my main driver and focus is on reducing costs. It's very important that you control that cost. And if you're not going to stay in business long, especially if you're starting out, and you're not controlling those costs. So that's why I have put that extra emphasis on controlling cost.
Yeah, well, businesses don't go out of business; they run out of money. Exactly.
Yeah. If you're well disciplined and you really control your cash outflow, you're setting yourself up for success time and time again. So I'm a huge advocate for that. But that's where I see a lot of opportunity is the discipline and rigor, and people when they say, why do I have to do this? I've always throughout my career done a really good job of explaining to people why you do things. And that's something that I think a lot of people in operations, even accounting controllers, they don't explain to people why they do what they do. People just, I'll never forget this one time I was working at a company called Toto. It's a plumbing supply manufacturer. So they make toilets, bidets, and faucets and whatnot. And in this factory where I worked, we high pressure cast toilets. And, there was a person on the line in the inspection area, and her job was to ring the toilet. So you take this wooden mallet and you ring it just to listen to a sound to see if there's any internal cracks in it. And I remember her, she was like, I don't know why I do this. She had to write down every single time that she did it. And I said, well, I'm going to tell you a story back from when I was in school. I had a professor that told me where he was actually an expert witness for a very large manufacturer of toilets that put a toilet or had a toilet installed in a public restroom. So it was a wall mount toilet. And there was actually a rather large individual who was using this toilet, fell from the wall. It cracked, shattered, and this person was bled to death due to this incident. And it was a major lawsuit against that manufacturer because they were alleging that there were internal cracks. Well, luckily for them, they had records.
You broke up there for a second. So say that again.
So what the event that happened to the person? Can you hear me, Nancy?
Yeah, because I lost you for a second there.
I lost you.
Yeah, there you are. Are you back? You're back.
Yes, I'm
You're back now. Okay, yeah. So you were saying. So I lost you really when you said that this was a larger person. Obviously, was using the facilities. Toilet breaks, cracks, and then what happens?
And the person, actually slashed on their backside, bad, almost bled to death. I'm talking like a 10-inch laceration, something along those lines, very gruesome. And it became a major lawsuit. And they went back and they sequestered all the quality control checks to make sure that happened. And it did. Luckily for them, that they had records that it happened. What ended up happening is the installer over-torqued the bolt for the wall mount and created a fissure crack at the wall mount. And that's actually why it failed. So people don't always understand that. I used to work in commercial glass, and I always had to explain this to people when you make a glass canopy that goes over your head, why you want to make sure that you've done a good temper and why it's laminated properly so when it breaks, it doesn't fall on people below you. These are things that people don't always, I think it's very important as a control person, be it for quality or cost, explaining to people why you do what you do and why it's important to the business is key if you want people to follow processes. I don't care if it's them reviewing an invoice, putting due diligence in the field and making sure that you're getting what you pay for. So that's something we haven't talked about, but on like lump sum contracts, the risk to a business is if you're putting the screws to them and you're holding them to that price, if you're paying for 4 inches of concrete and this happens, you might get 3.5. Or if you're supposed to have rebar 12 inches on center, they may make it 13 or 14 inches on center. They'll try to make up that cost by doing that. It happens. So having somebody that inspects in the field to make sure, and that's a service I offer as well, is field validation and supplementing where it may be necessary. But, having people understand why you do what you do and what happens is very important if you want people to follow a process and a control.
Yeah. I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. And like you said, those lawsuits, people don't realize that you can have the greatest project, greatest product or service in the world, but illegal, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
how many parking decks collapse because they're rushing the project?
Oh,
why? Because they're trying to make up for lost time. Why? Because there's no projects that are behind schedule that are on budget. It just doesn't happen. So they're trying to get on budget, or they're trying to remain profitable. All of these things are downstream effects. And that's why I say, if you just push for cost, then you're going to make people rush and make mistakes. If you push for value and understanding that you have those controls in place to make everyone successful, that's where I try to emphasize that true value is created when you mitigate risk on behalf of both parties. And that's usually what I try to do. I look out for both parties. Obviously, if a client's hiring me, I'm going to be somewhat slighted there. However, a true value creation for that client is going to be making sure that the project is successful, comes on budget, and then they actually have made a relationship with a vendor that they may actually want to do business with again.
Exactly.
That is a successful engagement for me.
Yeah. Well, those supplier relationships are so pivotal, especially in the scenarios where you're talking about, because these are big, big deals. It's not like you can just replace somebody that, it's, at a click of a button, I guess in some cases, but in these big manufacturing situations, I would think that would be pretty challenging.
You become beholden. I could probably give you examples of that for the rest of the day on that and where you have risk there. That's why, again, earlier is better. If you find out, and I've seen this, projects, they go over budget just when they know you can't switch out to another contractor, or just when they know that you've just acquired a huge customer that's waiting for your project to be complete because they just want to sell your product like gangbusters. They know these things, and sometimes you can be beholden to them. And so understanding how not to get yourself into that situation is also very important.
So it sounds like, from the other thing that what you're really saying too, is that knowing your suppliers is really important. So there's got to be on your side some real due diligence on the people that that you're coming into a project. Somebody hires you they're going to do a big project. It sounds like, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like ideally they bring you in early. They say, we're going to do this big project. We really want somebody to be almost grandfathering or overseeing everything that's happening here. And we also want you involved in that due diligence process, because I would think you can be a non-biased.
Yes, that's the lane I try to occupy, is a non-biased third party participant to make sure that you're making wise decisions. That is a very big part of my business as well.
Yeah, I can completely see this. So can better controls really actually improve trust then between the departments and then contractor leadership?
I think that when you implement a control, I think this is another thing, in addition to communicating why, is understanding why you do it. And there's a lot of people that'll do a control just because, well, that's what another company's doing, or that's the flavor of the day. We need to do this and we're going to mitigate fraud here. Well, it may not be applicable to your business first and foremost. That's why I'm a big firm believer in profitable controls. Any control that you implement should be profitable in nature. It shouldn't cost more than the value that it creates for having it. So if you're doing something and you're spending $1 million to reduce $100,000 in fraud, some people would argue that you're better off paying the $100,000 in fraud. Now, what I would say is that it depends, and if you're not doing enough to make sure that doesn't become $1 million fraud the next year because they know that they've gotten away with it, that's when you need to think about it. But it's very important that the controls that you implement are profitable and they are relatable to your business and applicable for the process. So I've seen many times where people will put redundancies in place. In a lot of industries, those are very necessary. But in some cases, it may be overkill, or you may be missing the boat altogether and you have another risk that you haven't identified. So it's very important that you do that exercise of understanding the controls that you put in place. Are they creating value for your business, and understanding why you do them?
Sure. So what would you tell like a CEO, CFO, or operations leader who says, we're too busy to look at this right now? What would you say to them?
Well, I could tell you that's part of the reason why my business exists, is because when I worked in private industry, there were one of the arguments for project managers not wanting to do cost reimbursable projects was that they didn't have the time to review invoicing, because many of them are thousands of pages long, very, very, very complex invoicing packages. And in many cases, they're right. So you need some sort of project controls element. So a lot of what my team, why it was created early on, was because there was an understanding need to have somebody that did that work and to make sure that those payment application packages were to the letter of the contract. So what I would say is there may be some truth there. You may not have. That's why you might want to consider having someone like myself that does that when necessary. For instance, a manufacturer that only does a large capital project every 3 years may not want to have a whole group of people that work in project controls similar to me. However, buy it when you need it. That's why I have this business. So if you don't have the right headcount in place to do that, that's why you would traditionally go to someone like myself and contract that out. But just to say we don't have time and we're not going to do it, you're opening yourselves up for a can of worms.
I mean, you're just setting yourself up almost like I would think for failure. So if someone is listening and feels like their business is growing, but catch is still tighter than it should be, what would you encourage them to really examine or look at?
So usually what I do, it's part of what I do in my business. When I look at an opportunity to help somebody that's struggling, and I always did this when I worked in private industry, you do what's called a cumulative spend review. So you look at the top, let's say 20 vendors, depends on the size of the business usually, but that's where you start. I would look at your top 20 vendors for spend, and then look at what they do for you, and look at overall how the contracts are written. So I would go through, like when I used to do what was known as a procure to pay audit. So this is something I could do for clients as well if they wanted me to do a procurement audit of their process. How are you procuring those goods and services? How are you competitively bidding? So I would look at that. The reason why I say cumulative spend is because if you have no company should ever say what their competitive bidding guidelines are. Let's say for the sake of conversation, it's $25,000. So and you've established that with your team that $25,000 is the threshold. And they need to competitively bid it above that amount. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to see a whole lot of contracts that come in at 24.5, 24.5, 24.5, 24.5, 24.5.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
If you do a cumulative spend review, you're going to look at it and say, oh, wow, the people that we've never competitively bid, we just spent $1 million with last year. Why is that? That's where you're losing money. I guarantee you that. So I traditionally like to do that cumulative spend review. So that's a very, very, very good tool in your toolbox. Very basic. You could do that. You look at who your top vendors are for spend, and then you look at how you're managing them. Are you competitively bidding? Are you doing T&M contracts? Are you doing lump sum contracts? What's the nature of the work? There are a number of ways that you can overpay there. Maybe it's unnecessary work. Maybe it's duplication. I found many cases where people double charge for work that they did and no one would notice and they would pay it. Where you are at risk as a business too is in your blanket contracts. So if you have a blanket PO and that would be for like a service, like a janitorial service or
Mhm.
whatnot. When you have blanket POs and
Yeah.
you don't manage them well, you don't manage the resources, you don't understand what they're doing, and then you have people in the field that are just hand waving and giving them change orders verbally, you've got a big problem. You're going to overpay. And then what you're going to find out is they're going to come back and they're going to say, hey, we just blew the budget on the $1 million PO. We need another $500,000 for all the things your people told us we should be doing. It's very important to understand those blanket contracts and put guardrails around them and who has the authority to delegate the work for those resources, because you will overpay if you don't manage that well. So that's another area. So I like cumulative spend, look at your blanket POs. There's a lot of areas that you should look, but you should always be looking. I'm in the weeds kind of guy. So I like to get
I would say you're a pretty detailed guy probably. And
you have to. And I learned very early in my career. That's what operations did for me. I had a supervisor that really kicked my butt. When I was a superintendent of a pharma plant, the general manager there really kicked my butt. And, I was young for the job and I had a lot of responsibility, like 140 FTEs working for me. And he said, listen, this is a contact sport. The money's made out there, not in the office. And I learned to not be timid. And you have to get in the weeds. You've got to understand where that blood loss is occurring. And a lot of times it's not from the computer. That's the one thing that I try to do in my business, is that I go to where that is occurring. Sometimes it's at the paper level or at the computer. It's happening at the computer. A lot of times it's happening in the field where you've got people that are, not following a process or a protocol, and that's where you're losing money. So,
and you talked about that, like that gal that you were talking about that was like, why am I doing this screw thing, right? I mean, and most people, you're not going to see that on a computer. You're not. Yeah. You're going to have to be there in face to face. So what is really next for Grabianowski and Associates?
Well, the thing is, for me, a lot of the work that I go after, I try to go after large capital construction projects. A lot of times, and I knew this going in, you've got very long lead times. Sometimes 3 years for some projects. Like I've got some potential work for projects that may not happen for 2 years. Wow. So you have to, with a business like mine, you always have to be thinking about headcount as I grow and I hire people. Can I keep them employed? Right. So I have to figure out what that healthy mix is of the types of clients that I have in my portfolio. So I'm actually trying to right now actually go after private equity firms, because I would like to find some consistent flow of customers that I can, have a core team that I can afford to always have employed. And then as I have other business that comes in, I can lift and shift as needed. So, that building that out, trying to figure out what's the right mix of clients for my business is what's really next for me, and trying to figure out what that looks like. Again, like the marketing piece, understanding, who my core clients are. It's been a big learning curve for me, but that is what's next.
That would be one thing, because you obviously can't do all this by yourself.
Right? No, you can't.
You have a team, so you have people behind you that are working with you, because obviously you wouldn't be able to take on that many clients. So you can probably take on more because you have people that are already working with you, and you shared that with me. So I wanted to make sure our listeners didn't think you were trying to do all this on your own. So
no. It's something that's it's important, though, in a business like mine, to be able to manage it and to have a consistent talent that available to you that you can always entrust.
So how can people get in touch with you and learn more about your work?
So the easiest way, on my website, you can actually, and I don't know if you're going to have a link posted up for that or not.
Yeah, I can. I'll post a link.
But if folks get that link, you can just go onto my website, and I have an inquiry form at the bottom where you can actually go through and just inquire about a potential project, and I will get back to you very quickly. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. If Nancy puts that link up as well, if you connect in with me, happy to have a discussion with you. And we can book a 30-minute call. I have a calendar that's always open for clients to discuss.
And most of these projects that you're working on, I got to believe that most of these companies are decent sized companies, right? Because they're doing these bigger projects. But what is, so really quickly, what is the ideal client for you? That is it somebody that's building out? I mean, I think in my world, a lot of people that are building medical office complexes and hospitals and expansion. Is that an ideal client for you?
Absolutely. That's an area I've been trying to get into. I've had some potential clients in that area. And there's a tremendous boom for the construction of hospitals, healthcare facilities. That is an area that is I have a particular interest in, and I'd love to grow. So if you happen to be building or constructing a facility, I would love to have a conversation with you on that. That's absolutely an area that I would like to grow my business.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for being here. And there's just so much valuable information in this conversation, because so many businesses, I think, are just not aware of this. And they like you said, they just pay those invoices. They don't think about it. I think that so many of them are losing money, and it really is a giant failure. I mean, in healthcare and dentistry, so many of these healthcare companies, they are screaming about the fact that they're just losing money. But when you go and you see some of the things that happen, it's like, it's no wonder that they're losing money through even these small leaks, and they're probably continuing to just repeat. So when, I think when leaders finally see these blind spots, they can really make better decisions and protect that margin, improve communication, and build a stronger business. I mean, it really, this hits, I would think, the balance sheet and the P&L in such a really, really big way. So I really appreciate the way you think about prevention and process and helping companies and solve these problems really before they, in some cases, before they become problems and become really, really expensive. So before we close, I want to leave you with something that connects directly to today's conversation. So much of business is not lost at the end. It's lost much earlier. It is lost when people do not ask the right questions. And it is lost when they miss the real problem. It is lost when they rush to present a solution before they really understand what is actually happening. And that is exactly why I wrote Stop Selling, Damn It. The book is about moving away from pressure-based selling and into solving, and is about creating alignment and building trust and what the buyer really needs, and helping people make confident decisions without pressure. And whether you're leading a company or working with clients, growing a practice, or trying to improve how your team really communicates the message, it really is simple. Stop chasing the yes and start solving the problem. So Stop Selling, Damn It is, of course, available on Amazon, and we're going to have the audiobook hopefully out here really soon. And you can also learn more about me at nancykaycoy.com. And thank you so much for joining me again on Inside the Business, Nancy Kay Coy. And until next time, keep asking better questions, keep looking for the truth underneath the surface, and keep having the conversations that move your business forward.